For the first Friday of each month, we gather to listen to the story of the creative life and mind of somebody who is from and lives in our community. And I have no doubt that Mary Jane Marcasiano was one of the people who inspired the creation of the series. It's true. Yes, you can certainly clap for her. Mary Jane has been a fixture in the lives, the creative circle of April and Eric for a good period of time, and has known them and been a part of the church as a sounding board, as a friend, as a creative conspirator from before the beginning, I think it's fair to say. She is sharing with us tonight her remarkable history as a creative person. And what I think, when we were writing the press release for this, one of the first quotes that was written by somebody on our staff was her iconic looks, her hair, her impeccable style. And while all of that is true, I think those of you who know her also realize that she is a person of true complexity and thoughtfulness and intellect. I think that style and substance are rarely found in equal measure in any person, and any one of us are lucky to have one of those traits, so Mary Jane has them both. So she will share with us her story, starting as a designer. She made a brilliant PowerPoint, leading all the way up to the present work and how her life and career in fashion evolved into a broad relationship, exploration, and support of culture and creativity. So I'm going to let you take it away, although I think your slides start in 1979, and I think it's only fair to start with a little bit before that, where you grew up, what you were like as a child, and what inspired you. How did you discover that you were a creative person?
Well, I was fortunate to grow up in a creative extended family. So my grandmother taught me to sew and to knit and crochet, and she actually used to bring me around to her friends, and I would sew on buttons and they would clap. So, so I guess early lesson, like creativity pays off. And then I was also very fortunate that my parents were very supportive of my creativity, and so that takes us to when I went to Parsons School of Design, which was,
you grew up around New York City.
I grew up in New Jersey, mm-hmm. Yeah, and my mother would drag me into the city for classes, and I went to fashion classes when I was in high school, and but then my dream was to go to Parsons, and actually there's a friend here today who was before Parsons, who we studied together, Robin. We studied together at Montclair University for 2 years before I went to Parsons. And there was always a little dichotomy between fine arts and fashion, but then fashion always would win. Mm. So I graduated from Parsons, and I was very lucky to be living in Soho in a great loft, and I just started making clothes. And these are my first designs from 1979. And so my mother was a hand weaver, and she wove all my fabrics, and then I would sew the pieces together. And around that time, which I'll talk about a little later, is what was going on in the 80s in Soho. But my first friend in Soho was Robert Lee Morris and the store Artwear. And so he opened his store, and I wandered in with one of my little outfits, and we became total buddies. And he started designing. So that dress in the middle, he actually designed the jewelry that was integrated into the garment. And then the figure on the the far right, those are his iconic belts. And we were actually together in a Mud Club show. It was the first fashion show in Soho, and it was at the Mud Club. And Robert and I were the models, and we modeled our clothes together. And so it was a great moment. So that. Yeah,
sounds like a piece of fashion history, really. Are there photos from that?
I tried to find it. I mean, the problem with, this time period of my life is it's pre-digital and pre-iPhones and so there's not a lot of, it's just what's available, like, that's been scanned, like New York Times articles that are scanned print. So the All Mixed Up, that was the show that I did with Robert, my first fashion show. And I did the show at a art gallery, the Susan Caldwell Gallery. And that started like a precedent for me of, I had all my fashion shows in galleries. So I always laughed. I showed it Mary Boone, I showed it Costelli, I showed it Barbara Gladstone.
That's a pretty distinguished list of galleries to have shown it. Most artists would die for that that resume.
Exactly. So this is the first show which featured Robert's work along with mine. And so, the 80s in Soho was everything. In reality was exactly what you would hope it was. It was just this hotbed of creativity, and there were galleries and designers and artists. And so I was making these clothes in the loft, and journalists and buyers would trek down to Soho. At that time, it was like a trek. Like, people didn't just, it wasn't the way we think of it now. And one day, like, the doorbell rings, and it's a buyer from Bloomingdale's. So I get in my freight elevator, I go downstairs, crossing my fingers that the elevator doesn't break, because it always did. And this buyer gets in, and she comes up to my studio, and she places an order.
Wow.
And
how old were you at that time?
22.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, I called up my parents, and I was like, how do I do? How do I do this? And so, we made the clothes. But the funniest part is I put the clothes in shopping bags, and I got on my bicycle, and I rode up to Bloomingdale's, and I went to the delivery dock, and they were like, what are you doing? You have to ship it by UPS. I'm like, what's that? Anyway, so, but it was an amazing time, because like a year later, I had all the windows of Bloomingdale's, Lexington Avenue windows, and it was,
wow.
It was super, super exciting time. So,
would you describe any particular aesthetic that you were pursuing at that time in fashion? Was there
Yeah.
something? What was that?
Yeah, so minimalism was, very prominent in the art world. That was the world I was living in. I was a minimalist. It was so my work reflected like the milieu that I was in.
So you had an awareness that of the visual and fine artists that were working around you, that you were more or less responding to some of those same ideas and forms, yet
Yes.
in a wearable form.
Yes, and I was also looking for something that wasn't there. Like I just wanted very simple, sexy clothes that anyone could wear and feel comfortable in. And I was trying to create something that wasn't in the market at the time. So then this was my first article in Vogue, and so I became like the young designer, and I was a young designer for quite a few years.
Yeah, I think you were a young designer for about 25 years,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
But there is something notable there, because this is a really defining moment in the history of American fashion. It was a period where the idea of the young American fashion designer was happening, perhaps arguably for the first time.
It was. I mean, like the people that we were looking up to were, was like Calvin Klein and Donna Karan. They were the first. I mean, it was when American design was, was getting on the map,
Coming into its own.
And then, that's self-explanatory. But let me just go ahead to. Oh, where's that shot with the? Oh, sorry, and I lost it.
Do you want Selena to go to one specifically?
Oh, there it is. Sorry, the one on the far left. That was the article on new designers, and that's Michael Kors on the floor, and Catherine. I can't remember her name, but we were a whole group. We were a group of young designers, and we were always grouped together, and we were new, because the idea of an independent designer didn't exist at that time. So I'll go back. Sorry.
Was financing an issue for you?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, I borrowed money from all my friends and family, to produce my first collections. And, it was, I mean, the reality was, it was very exciting on print, but the reality was very, and then you had amazing stores like Barney's who would give you orders, but they wouldn't pay you for, 6 months. And so I always used to say, yes, they support young designers, It's like they put young designers out of business, in fact,
Right.
So these are some editorials from the 80s. By then, at a certain point, I started to expand my collection and to licensing. And so I was designing shoes and jewelry, and I was working with an Italian cashmere company and doing cashmeres and shearlings that were made in Italy. And it was, and I actually was licensing that kept us in business.
I was going to say, I mean,
Yeah.
that's a very savvy business tactic.
Yeah.
How did you come up with that?
My dad helped me with that, and a friend, Henry Hacker, who was my licensing agent, and they did a great job of, and then the big break was when they licensed my whole collection in Japan.
Wow.
So basically the Japanese were supporting all the young designers because they would do a license and you'd go to Japan, do your collection there. But, they were paying you basically what you needed to keep your business afloat.
Were you still able to connect with yourself as a creative person while also developing it into a business?
Well, yeah, that it was really hard. And as we go further into the 80s and then into the 90s, it really, it became a drag, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's look.
Yeah. But we're still in the good days, so let me show you some more of the good
Great.
days. These are Mademoiselle, and expanded to menswear, and that's from an article in DNR. And then, doing the runway shows. So I just want to point out that on the upper, is that my right? Yeah, is Frauke, who is Talina's mom, and she was one of my main runway models. She was amazing, stunning person, and I do want to do a shout out to the models because these were models who were working for all the major designers in Europe and in New York, and they would do my show for clothes. And then one model would tell another model, and that's Alva Chin on the far right in the white. And I mean, she was, the muse of Alaya and Oscar de la Renta, and every major designer. But she was a friend, and she did my show, and she told other friends. And a shout out to Alva. She's had a resurgence lately, and she's on the cover of Town and Country this month, which is amazing.
Fun.
Yeah, well deserved because I don't think people realize how much the models inform the designers and what they contribute to. So it's nice to see people recognized.
Absolutely.
At this point. And yeah, so Harper's Bazaar at this point in the 80s was a great magazine, and Rico Pullman was a really beautiful photographer, and his minimalism really matched mine. So he used my clothes a lot in the magazines. So that's his shot of Jerry Hall in my white jumpsuit, and that was there's another really hot model from that period in the audience tonight, Susan Forrest. There she is, Susan Forrestal. So this was probably one of my favorite collections, and I was also thrilled to get this much coverage in Vogue in 1988. And that was my neon mohair collection and shearlings, and that was an exciting time. And this is more Harper's Bazaar in '88. So here you can see the shift in fashion when we got into the sexy, the little black dresses of the '80s, and the influence of active sportswear on clothing. And in some ways, I feel like that image in the middle, it's very contemporary. I mean,
Yeah,
you
and
can
the
see-
role of activewear in
Yeah.
everyday ready-to-wear is
Yeah,
now,
but that
it's
wasn't
huge.
like, it wasn't a given at that time. It was something that was, developing. So it was, and that's another thing is like, I also want to do a shout out to the makers. Like I had so many fabric companies and yarn companies who, both in the U.S. and in Europe, and factories who would work with me on developing unique and new things. And a lot of it had to do with stretch fabrics and, so it was an
It's a very
exciting-
innovative field, fabric and textile design, and yet also one of the oldest industries in the world.
Yes.
As any artist of any genre understands, there is a direct relationship between material and form. It's not something that's forced.
No, it's like I couldn't have done my work without their innovations. So it was, but they also needed designers to push them to innovate. So it was
A symbiotic relationship.
Yeah.
At what scale were you producing at this point? Like how were you shipping all over the world? How many thousands of garments would you make for a collection?
Yeah, I mean, I was shipping all over the world. I was making all over the world. It was, and at that point, I had a really big studio, and I had a full sample making room, and also that's, the people that make the pattern makers, the sample makers. I mean, also this, designers. This is essential to what we do. So, Linda Simpkins, who was my assistant, who's an amazing pattern maker. I still work with her today.
Oh, wow.
But these are people who, I couldn't have done my work without them. So
Right.
I think much more. I was always jealous of my friends who are artists who could go alone into a studio with a palette, and that was it. I needed so many people.
Right.
To be,
You need a team of people.
And I think that's, in later years, that's why I like collaboration, because,
It's inherent to how you work.
It's the part of the process, yeah. And there is Ralph.
So do we want to touch on that briefly? Because one of the questions that I asked you before we started the conversation was, you've been sharing your life now for 4 decades with an artist. How has a working, living, breathing artist, how has that impacted your life as a creative person?
Yeah, I think, living in the milieu that I did and living with Ralph, it teaches a lot about creativity. And, I always admire how artists go every day to their studios and they find their way that day. And I think that, being inspired every day was something that Ralph taught me and, definitely rubbed off on. Because it's harder because, you're going to the office, you're going to your studio, which is also your office. So it's a little different. So some days it's harder to be inspired, but it's that sustaining over a long period of time that's important.
What do you find, or what would you have said then? It's hard to go have a Wayback Machine, but what is the difference between art and fashion for you?
I think, so I want to say a word about design. I mean, the reason why I like design is because design is problem solving, okay? I'm incapable of creating my own problems. I mean, I think artists go into the studio and they create their own problems and they solve them.
So
I
well
need a problem. So if the problem is come up with 50 outfits for spring 1988, okay, I can go to work and work on that. So I think that's the main difference is that I need to be a problem solver in my creativity. That's basically what I would say.
And that's still important in how you're working today. Well,
it is, yeah.
Let's look more at the 80s.
But anyway, so that Ralph, that's a photo shoot for Elle, and Ralph was modeling my menswear, and he was always my test model, and he wore a lot of kind of extreme things that I forced him to wear, including knit pants, and which are now a given, but back then it was kind of weird to see a guy in knit pants. But as you know, Ralph can pull it off.
He still can. He
Yes.
wears knit pants to our opening that are
Exactly.
these
He's
great
still wearing those knit
ribbed
pants.
knit pants. They're fabulous. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so now going forward to the 90s. So it was harder to stay in business and harder to stay motivated, because I never really I never had a really huge company behind me or partners, so I had was handling mostly everything on my own. But in the 90s, I discovered this yarn, chenille, which was used in basically in bedspreads and bathrobes. But there was a company in New Jersey called Silk City Yarns, and they had this chenille yarn, and so I started making these sweaters, and it became like a big hit at Bergdorf's. And Ellen Salzman, who was the fashion director then, she was very supportive. And so I feel like the 90s, that was kind of my last hurrah, my last fashion hurrah. And then I was getting burnt out. And then I just remembered something, which is, at that point I went to a psychic. Which, I don't think Ralph even knows this, but I went to a psychic, and I said, what's going to happen to me? What's my future? So they came back and they said to me, we see you on the stage. And I go, oh, the stage, that sounds good. They go, no, you're backstage. And I'm like, no, you don't know me. I'm not going to be backstage. Yeah, you're on the wings. You're in the wings backstage. And I go, oh, okay, whatever. I paid them and I left. And this person really did predict the future.
That really, truly, yeah. And when the 90s were tough for you personally, do you think that any of that was the changing economic and politics that there was towards the end of the 20th century, there was a lot going on?
Well, it was really more the industry was changing. The fashion industry, everything was being bought up by, there was, very
the
few
independent
companies.
Designers were selling themselves to
Yeah, and there were very few companies, very few stores left, and you had to be very big to compete. And so competing as independent was
increasingly difficult.
Yeah, it was
and you saw this like Michael Kors, Liz Claiborne, these were people of your generation that started getting into big business deals.
Yeah, I mean, we were always like neck to neck, and then when he did his IPO on Wall Street, I was like, well, guess he won that one. But it wasn't my destiny to do that. So I'm going to take a brief commercial break here to talk about Eric and April, who unfortunately aren't here. They're in Italy, but I wish they were, because I could thank them for the church and also their friendship. So everybody thinks that Ralph and Eric met on the tennis courts, and that's how we got to know each other. Well, it's not true. In I don't know what year, it was in the 80s, a wonderful photographer, Jeanette Montgomery, was doing a photo shoot for me for Harper's Bazaar, and Ellen Burney was the art director, and they had seen Eric's studio and seen his work from Saint-Tropez, and they thought it would be great to do the photo shoot there. So I arrived in Eric's studio, and I just said to him, I said, I'm amazed. I said, all the artists I know would never let, this group of fashion people into their studio. And he looked around, and he's like, are you kidding me? 4 gorgeous women? Why wouldn't I do this? So I got to know Eric's humor right from the get-go. So when I was leaving, I said, I'd like to thank you. Do you have a girlfriend that I could give some, make some clothes for? And he's like, yeah, my girlfriend April. I said, well, give her my number, and I'd like to make her something to thank you for doing this. So one day April came to the studio, and I made her some clothes, and then we came out to Long Island, and we were walking in Sag Harbor, I think, and we bumped into them, and that was sort of the start of the whole Sag Harbor era.
The Sag Harbor era, which actually became really, it has impacted the creative lives and careers of all of you who were a part of it, and that is a circle of friends that, in fact, was the subject of a body of paintings by Eric.
Yes.
And you guys had started coming out here in the 70s. Yes.
Yeah, we came out here when we met in the late 70s, And then while I was researching this presentation, I came across, I kind of had forgotten, and I immediately wrote April and said thank you. I mean, April was invited to do sets for a ballet by Christopher D'Amboise at the New York City Ballet in 1988, and she suggested that I do the costumes, and I did, and it was my first foray into dance, and it was obviously had a big impact on me, and I continued in that field. But this was my first time, and it was with April. And then this is a more recent collaboration with Eric. He was doing this suite of sculptures called 10 Breaths that was going to be shown in Germany. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
I think that was around 2010. Is that accurate?
Yeah, mm-hmm. And he had this idea. He wanted some of the figures to be dressed, and he thought that they might be more vulnerable if some of them were dressed in contrast. So I was like, wow, how are you going to dress the sculpture? And so I looked at Degas, the little dancer, and I kind of saw how he integrated fabric. And then I hand painted the silk to match Eric's the patina on this. And then the hard part was like affixing it to the sculptures. But it was an exciting
foray. Yeah. Did the skirts have remained permanent component of the sculpture, or was it just for that exhibition?
Yeah. And so I actually have a box of fabrics, which I keep archivally, so that I know one day I'm going to get a phone call that the skirt ripped or disintegrated, and can you remake the skirt? So I have that.
You're right. Yeah,
I'm ready for that. So this was a little break because now starts a completely different part of my life, and. This is a statement that I make about this next phase of my life, which is that I'm honored to be invited to collaborate with artists representing the cultures of West Africa and the African diaspora, because it became a very important part of what my work was going to look like over the next 20 years. So I had a good friend who danced with Alvin Ailey, Sarita Allen. She was really one of their great divas, and she knew I loved Brazilian music, so she invited me to see Dance Brazil at the Joyce Theater in 2001. And I went, and I was just completely captivated. And I went backstage to meet the choreographer, and I volunteered to do their costumes. And so a month or two later, I get a phone call inviting us to Brazil, and I said to Ralph, "We're going to Brazil," and we did, and we both really fell in love with the culture. Ralph ended up doing a book, and I did their costumes for a number of years. But besides connecting me to Brazil, what it did was connect me to West African culture, because Bahia in the northwest of Brazil is a completely Afro-Brazilian culture, and it's connected to West Africa and the Yoruban culture. So on the left, or the right, sorry, the dancers with the white, those are the gods and goddesses of the Yoruban pantheon of gods, and the one on the far right in blue is Iemanjá, who's the goddess of the sea, and she keeps cropping up in my work.
Still. Interesting.
Yeah. So then through Sarita, I started to work with, there was a lot of offshoots of Alvin Ailey. There was complexions and rhythmic, and so there was Sarita invited me to Jacob's Pillow to do the costumes for 6 different choreographers that had worked with Ailey. And I started working with some of these. And so it's interesting that these turquoise blue outfits turned out to be a ballet on Iemanjá by an African-American choreographer, and we showed it in Harlem. And so it was interesting, then I started to make the connection between West Africa, Brazil, and African-American cultures, and the Yoruban culture that connected them.
From the perspective of being a designer, and because I know we're going to talk so much about other ways that this particular experience has had an indelible impact on the trajectory of your life and some of your thinking. But first, as a designer, what were some of the lessons learned and the challenges of now working with a new culture, as well as working with the utilitarian aspect of clothing that has to be accounted for a body that is in constant motion?
Yeah, that was initially when I did the first ballet with April. I was in shock because I was like, you mean they're not just standing there looking pretty? Like they're going to move, and especially the male dancers, they were so ornery. They were just like moving their belts, and it just made it very difficult. So I got the picture that okay, the dancer is the king here, and I'm just serving and that's what really taught me it was a good lesson, because when you work in the performing arts, you're serving the performers, not the opposite. Mm-hmm. So you have to make you have to make your statement, but you have to make a statement with them, and you have to make their life and their work easier. Mm-hmm. So, but having worked with a lot of stretch fabrics, and it was easy for me to adapt to that kind of construction, and Okay, so Latasha, which I'll tell you about, I met Latasha when I went back to get my master's degree at NYU in 2017, and we were in the same social studies cohort, and which we basically just, she kept me sane through the whole thesis project, as I did with her. And it's interesting because on Sunday at Guildhall, Dr. Deb Willis is going to be interviewing Renee
Cox.
Yeah, and Dr. Willis was Latasha Barnes' thesis advisor. Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's great.
And so it'll be interesting to. So Latasha's thesis turned into the Jazz Continuum, mm-hmm. and you probably all know and saw it. The Jazz Continuum was here last summer, mm-hmm. and they were in residency.
Yes.
And which was great for me because I got to spend a lot of time with them, which was in advance of my doing the costumes for the Joyce. So I'm going to show you a little clip because you probably saw it in a very early stages when it was here in workshop, but it was a spectacular show at the Joyce.
So great. Also, I mean, the Jazz Continuum is excellent, and so is Latasha. And since we're talking about you, you have a consistent palette. You can see the colors that you were using through the 80s is continuing on in the work that you're doing now.
And it's funny because Latasha loves 80s fashion. So, and she loves color, so, we were...
It's perfect.
Yeah, it was,
marriage.
But her style of dance was a challenge, extra challenge, because they were doing, swing and hip hop, all different styles, and they really put a lot of stress on the costumes.
I'm sure.
Yeah. In fact, we have to remake them all they're going to be at Kennedy Center, and we've got to remake everything because they're,
demolished.
It's pretty much demolished. So, for those of you who know me, you know that Angelique Kidjo has become a huge part of my life, my creative life. So I guess I met her around, 10 to 15 years ago. Annie O'Hayan, who works in the music industry, introduced us, and she thought that I would be a great costume designer for Angelique. And Angelique is she's a premier world artist, diva, but she's also very active in social justice and for women in Africa, and she's a UNICEF ambassador, and she's always appearing with governments and with at the UN, and so I dress her for the stage and also for these appearances. But this was in 2018. It was the centenary of the armistice in Paris, and it was the first year that the French government acknowledged the role of African soldiers in the war, and they did an event under the Arc de Triomphe with all the world leaders, and they invited only 2 performers, Yo-Yo Ma and Angelique Kidjo. And I'll just show you a little bit of it because
And you designed what she wore.
Yeah, and so of course I wanted it to be regal, I wanted to have a French reference, but I wanted it to be African. Oh, and I think I forgot to mention that we started working with these African Dutch wax prints, which are iconic in West Africa. It's what all the women wear. And so I discussed it with Angelique in general, and I said, since you're really representing these women all over the world, I think it would be nice if you started wearing the fabrics again. I know you wore them when you were a young woman, and you've gone through a lot of different styles, but I think it would send a really big message for people to see you on the international stage in these fabrics. So that's when we started doing that. But in this particular one, I picked a particular print that was a very regal print. Oh, sorry. How do I get to the video?
The video? Selena.
So you can see who's in the audience there. Which I have to tell, I asked Ralph and Cher if I should tell this story, but so we were in this little shack where the artists were housed. So it's like Angelique, Yo-Yo Ma, myself, and we're waiting to get called, to go out. And then we're like, what's going on? They said they're waiting for Trump and Putin. So Yo-Yo Ma and I are like hanging out the window looking, and we see these 2 limos pull up, Putin's and Trump, right next to us.
Wow. And
they sat there, and they were waiting. They wanted to be one of them wanted to be the last one out. So finally, Trump got out and walked into the audience, and then Putin won that battle and walked out. And we were just like hysterical. But so a little bit more about Angelique's costumes and the fabrics. So besides the fabrics being beautiful, literally imprinted in the fabrics are messages. So and that African women send messages through the fabrics. Like there's a very funny print that's a fan, like a handheld, and it's called Hot Hot, and you wear that on your honeymoon, And then there's another one with like 2 chairs, and it's like, if you have something bad to say, come and sit down next to me to talk about it.
Oh, I love that.
So you can send messages, from what you're wearing. So when I first started working with Angelique, I mean, she had won many Grammys, but the first Grammy where I dressed her is the one in the middle. And I said, well, let's just go for it. You're a star. Let's send the message of star, And then the other Grammy outfit, I think it was the next year. So Angelique has a foundation called the Batanga Foundation, which is for girls' education in West Africa. So one of the young ladies that studies there made her the necklace, and they said, please, would you wear it when you get your Grammy? So Angelique brought me the necklace, and I said, okay. And then, so Vlisco is this Dutch company that makes a lot of the fabrics that the women wear. They had the print that she's wearing is called the City of Joy, and it was a print made to support the City of Joy, which is a home in the Congo for women who've been victims of violence,
Wow.
during the wars. So I said, we'll send, a double message, the message of hope, the City of Joy, supporting these women, and then supporting the young ladies of Batanga. And then the other image is an ad campaign for Vlisco, where you really get to see the array of the beautiful...
Beautiful textiles, yeah.
Yeah. What's next? Oh, okay, so Imanja reappears as Yemanja, and Yemanja is in West Africa, that she is the goddess of the sea, and she traveled to Brazil with the enslaved people who were brought to Brazil, where she became Imanja. So in 2021, Angelique and her daughter produced a musical about the story of enslavement in Benin in West Africa. And the set designs were by Carrie James Marshall, and I did the costumes, and it was...
That sounds incredible.
It was a really great, really fun collaboration. So this is something I did for the theater. So Michael Hall's band, who has
It's in the current show, yeah.
is the current show in Paris on Warhol and Basquiat.
And here upstairs.
Oh, and upstairs too, yes.
Yeah.
So he introduced me to Calvin Levels, who wrote a play about the Warhol-Basquiat collaboration. And Calvin, we workshopped it. A lot of times in theater, you're just workshopping, and then working towards it, going to the theater. So we didn't have much of a budget, but I had a lot of fun, and I pulled pieces from friends and made things, and we did that play together.
That's great.
Oh, and now we get into costume design for film. So Bruno Barreto is a very well-known Brazilian director. You may know his first film, which was Dona Flor and Her Two Husbands, and which was actually like one of the first dates that Ralph and I went to. We went to see that film. Then I ended up working for Bruno. So this was a film which we showed at the Sag Harbor Cinema years ago, called Reaching for the Moon, about Elizabeth Bishop. Yeah. And there's Treat Williams, who played Robert Lowell, and unfortunately, he just recently...
Oh, did he really?
He died in a motorcycle crash.
Oh, I didn't know
he was
that.
very young.
Oh, sad.
Very young, vibrant guy.
Yeah.
But, yeah. And then this is a mini-series that Bruno produced called The American Guest, and it's about Teddy Roosevelt, his expedition in Brazil and the Amazon. So just show a little clip.
President, may I present Colonel Cândido Mariano da Silva Rondon.
So what do you say?
Why not a bit of exploring?
Did you want
Solo adventure in Brazil.
There are always dangers.
No. P.T., you are not going to the Amazon.
That was Edith, had the last word.
President, may I present
sorry.
Colonel Cândido Mariano.
Okay. So this was a great project to work on, because it was the period was the early 1900s, and in terms of fashion, it was when Victorian fashion was shifting to a new look. And so I also want to mention that when working with actors, especially in films, there's so much a part of the process, because quite often they do a lot of their own research, and you'd be very smart to listen to them, because they often know more about the characters than you can ever find out. And that was the case of Aidan Quinn, who played Teddy Roosevelt. He knew exactly what Teddy should look like and what glasses, but he was great to work with, as was Dana Delaney, who played Edith Roosevelt. And I said to I basically said to her that I wanted to use real vintage clothing from that period. Unfortunately, she's like a size 0, so, because if you look at the vintage clothing, they're like this big.
Right.
And she also agreed to wear an original corset.
Oh, wow.
Which she would wear all day long. She'd even, go to lunch in it, and, she wanted to
Sounds
feel,
terrible.
So it's again, the collaboration, like working with actors, is very exciting.
Yeah.
And then we get into a different aspect of my work, which is my work in nonprofit. And so about 12, 15 years ago, I got involved with this organization called Cinema Tropical, which supports Latin American cinema in the US. And I basically went to them and said, you're not doing enough with Brazil. And they were like, yeah, we'll do it. So they gave me carte blanche to curate series, and which I did for Film at Lincoln Center, Museum of Moving Image, different institutions, and then also together with its founder, Carlos Gutierrez, we created the Cinema Tropical Awards, which was the first awards for Latin American cinema in the U.S.
Wow.
So that was.
Is that still continuing?
Yeah, we do it every year. We do it every year.
That's great.
And we have I'm programming a Brazilian film festival in August in New York City. So,
how do you maintain a practice as a film and music curator while also being a designer?
it's because I love Brazil so much, and so I like to I follow. I used to go every year to the festival in Rio prior to the pandemic. So I follow and I've also have a lot of friendships in Brazil with Brazilian directors, and so I just stay current.
Stay current.
Yeah, and then I also, on the one on the right, Veredas, which we did at Film at Lincoln Center, I co-curated that with a young Brazilian curator.
Wow.
Yeah. And then, this kind of happened when I was in Brazil. I created the Made with Love project, which was a simple concept, which was to support women's crafts. And then to use the proceeds from the sales to support projects that aided children in the area. So the bracelets, which I guess I'm sure a lot of you have seen the bracelets, I started selling those. And then my friend Betsy Ross gave a set to Chris Martin from Coldplay. And he wore them on the cover of the Rolling Stones. And I got a call from Live Nation saying, we'd like to sell the bracelets on tour. So thanks to that collaboration, we raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for the Empire des Enfants, which saves homeless children on the streets of Dakar.
Wow.
And I
yeah,
continue
you can
to
clap
work.
for that. That's pretty incredible. It's because I know we spent so much time looking in depth at your fashion, and now all of a sudden, I mean, I don't even think anybody can predict where this is going to, because the fertile mind and creative process that you now see expanding into projects that all of which inherently revolve around collaboration, community, and the empowerment of others.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's why I kind of divided. That's why I put the little commercial in the middle, because I divided. It's basically two different lives, and I know a lot of people know me for one life and not the other. And so it was thank you for this invitation, because it was a great chance to put it all together, which I never really get a chance to do. And I'm sure there's people who are my friends who probably didn't know a lot of things about me. So.
I had just so many people just pantomimed. I can see it. You guys can't know.
And then this is my other nonprofit project that I work with. It's Impact Repertory Theater in Harlem, which is, I'll let them explain very briefly what they do.
Impact Repertory Theater is a youth non-for-profit organization that caters to the needs of young people between the ages of 12 and 18 in leadership training and the arts. We've coined the phrase artivism, which is an artist and an activist combined. We encourage the young people.
So I don't know if Susan Penzer is in the audience.
I haven't seen her.
But she introduced me to Jamal Josephs, who's the artistic director and founder of Impact. And Jamal is a former Black Panther, and he's a professor at Columbia. He was the head of the film school at Columbia. And I started volunteering there, and then I said to Jamal, I'm thinking about going back to school and getting my master's degree. If I do that, could I intern here? And could I go from being a volunteer to an intern? He's like, oh, absolutely, and I really encourage you to do it. So it became a funny routine because he would drag me out of events. He would say, oh, I'm going to bring out our intern. Everyone's expecting this kid. And I would come out. It was like a little routine that we had going. But what I ended up doing was I used impact and cinema tropicale as case studies for my thesis. And basically, from working in these nonprofits, I felt that what was applicable to larger nonprofits wasn't really working for smaller arts nonprofits, and that there had to be better ways to do it. And so that was, the reason I decided to get my master's degree was I wanted to help these organizations, and I wanted to be more informed about what I was doing. And I ended up, having an amazing time studying, and and that's sort of that's where I am.
Well, I mean, this is really interesting. I think the last slide says what's next. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm not sure.
The point of your thesis is really fascinating to me, and I spent a little time reading it as well as some of the papers that you were nice enough to share with me.
Thank you for doing that.
The grad school papers. And, it's really fascinating for me as somebody who has, obviously now runs an organization and has worked in the art world for more than a quarter of a century, and to engage with the very, very fresh ideas that you have that also have precedent within the formation of professionalized art institutions in America. And I'm so curious how you would articulate, first you should articulate the central thesis. Tell us what you think about museum funding and boards.
Oh, don't make me do that. Oh, you put me in a hot spot.
Uh-oh, okay.
No, but I just don't think what's right for one institution is right for every institution. And, at the time I felt like that small nonprofits, especially small nonprofits of color, were burdened with having to meet criteria to get funding that wasn't fair to, impose. And, when I first proposed that, it was kind of a radical idea. And then as I proceeded in my studies and by the time I graduated and I was going to conferences, I started to hear that reflected, because funders were, if you want to be funding diverse organizations, you have to look at it in a different way. You can't impose the same metrics,
right,
on a small organization in Harlem that's got, 3
Sure,
employees that's doing good work and needs the money, but can't provide the metrics, for it.
Or even the process.
Yeah.
Grants administration in and of itself it's onerous and time-consuming and requires a certain skill set. And it's very difficult for small-scale not-for-profits. And I think in your paper, this is defined as organizations of less than $250,000.
Yes.
I would argue that it would even be any organization less than $1 million.
Right.
Really, especially today. 4 years ago was, even that's made a big difference. But to be able to develop the infrastructure of writing a grant is something that is really time-consuming. And it does, is similar to the SATs in the college system, predisposes people who have access to certain resources to be the ones who can access the resources, which is essentially what I guess your direct experience was as you started out. That's the link, right?
Yes.
You're working with Brazil towards the end of your career in fashion, going there for the first time with Ralph, and seeing then how this global fusion of art and ideas ultimately winds up taking an organizational form that has certain challenges. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and the other thing that I have to say is that I would not feel comfortable going to these other cultures if I wasn't giving back in some way if I wasn't conscious of the fact that these cultures were giving me so much that it's important for me to give back to the cultures in some way, whether it's to help them get grants or to whatever, it's, to fund, to help fund projects, that's,
It's incredible. So I think I want to just, I want to open up to questions, but I do have a last question for you. Since you say what's next, well, let's ask you, what's next?
Well, I'm actually thinking about getting another master's degree.
I love that idea.
Yeah, in costume studies, because costume studies is not a costume design. It's about historical references and patterns and how fashion connects and clothing connects to the culture at large. And there's some issues that I'm interested in, and I think I'm looking into that. That's
Very exciting. Thank you. So we do have time for questions. Anybody want to ask Mary Jane a question? So we have, Jürgen right here.
Can you, well, I'm kind of thinking about where your aesthetic is at now, given your past experience starting out with minimalism, African pattern, and
maximalism now,
and then Brazilian color and wildness.
Yeah.
So, I mean, are you able to combine these, or have you left minimalism completely? And sort of. So, what's your aesthetic journey, basically? A little bit more than what you saw.
That's a good question. I think I try to find a happy medium between expressing the cultures in color and print, but still doing minimalism more in like the shapes and so like what I did for Latasha Barnes, like the color was very exuberant and there was sparkles but the shapes were fairly clean and but for sure working with the prints is a form of maximalism.
There's no simulation happening.
Yeah. Yes.
I have another question for you. What is it like for you to reflect upon this history, to see this slideshow, to share it with people?
Actually, it was this process of preparing for tonight was very cathartic and healing for me because I really like the first 20 years of my career in fashion. For years, I thought it was someone else it was someone else's life. It just didn't feel like my life, and kind of going back and looking at it and appreciating it, like I reclaimed that part of myself, which was nice, and I realized how it informed
where you are today.
Where I am today, but it always seemed to be like a big break,
Like a pivot, not as much of a continuum.
Yeah, exactly. But now I see it.
Now you
more.
see the continuum a little more.
Yeah.
That's so
Thanks.
interesting. Thank you. Any other questions? Oh, Netta.
I just have a comment. Knowing that Jane is single, there's so much more there that she does and can do and doesn't tell us, like the greatest person. Really, I just think she's so talented and great human being and just incredible.
Absolutely.
Oh, thank you.
I agree.
Thank you.
Any other? Nancy.
The African designs that you used, they were original. You didn't design those.
No, they're original.
Obviously, that's what I thought. They were stunning, really stunning.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole, I'm not going to get into it tonight, but that's a whole story, is the story of those fabrics is fascinating. Yeah.
So you're not saying every African design that I saw in Africa had a story?
They do, the prints do, but I mean the whole overall, because the fabrics were, they're based on Indonesian wax prints that the Dutch bought.
Yeah.
And then they brought them back to the Netherlands and they tried to reproduce them. And then they tried to sell them back, because the Dutch are great traders, they tried to sell them back to the Indonesians, and the Indonesians didn't want them. So then they kept it on the boat and they took it to their next colony, which was in West Africa. And there it caught on. So it's it's a story of, it's a bad story of
Colonialism.
colonialism, but it's actually had a very happy ending, because it ended up being that, the fabrics became an important part of the life.
Very.
But it also, the women, it became a means of economic growth for the women. So the women were the salespeople for these fabrics. And in fact, they were called Mama Benz because they were so successful they could buy Mercedes-Benz.
I love it.
Yeah, and in fact, Angelique's grandmother was a Mama Benz. So,
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's
really
fascinating.
interesting. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions? Oh, Susan Kappa.
Oh, Susan, hi.
Hi. I agree with Netta, and I'm sitting here realizing how nonchalant and ease and graceful you are. No one knows what you do because you just do it. And I actually, one of the things I really responded to is designing for dance is not easy, and you're making it sound much easier than it is. So if you can, I'm curious of your process. Do you have to, how many times do you watch the dance? Is it before it's choreographed? Do you go to practices? Because like you said, it has to be comfortable for them, but they're expressing something. There's so much to it that I'd just like to hear more of your process.
Yeah, I usually try to embed myself a little bit, with the company, well, of course, I'm talking to the choreographer and getting in early stages, maybe even before they start, doing the work, but discussing the themes. And then I try to get to know the dancers and to watch them perform and to understand their bodies. And as I said, when Jazz Continuum was here, it was such a real luxury, because every day I just wander over, for a week, and I got to really get to know, what the dancers were. And I also talked to them, about sitting over coffee and in the residency, saying do you like suspenders? Just casually, so things like that. So, but it's really hard, and dancers are wonderful and difficult at the same time. They're really. So I'm glossing over that part. Yeah.
Any other questions? Mary Jane, thank you so much. This has been illuminating.
Thank you.